Phoenix, Arizona, November 1992. The body of a 22-year-old female college student discovered near the city's canal.
Angela was found with so many different stab wounds and decapitated. And at that point, nobody knew where her head was.
10 months later, another mutilated body found by the same canal, but this time it's a 17-year-old teen girl.
The canal became a ghost town. It was such a evil, despicable murder. I think the entire city really became in fear, and especially women.
This is the story of two sadistic murders that terrorize the Phoenix community. That's until the powers of investigative genetic genealogy and passionate cold case detectives combine to try and catch a killer. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Bloodline Detectives. Phoenix, Arizona, 1992. It's supposed to be a year of new beginnings for Angela Brosso. Angela and her boyfriend just moved from Pennsylvania to Phoenix and planning a new future in this desert city.
Angela was a very sharp, very outgoing person. She was doing very well in her work. So she was very bright, very well liked, and an overall good person.
November 8, 1992, the day before Angela's birthday. She decides to go for one of her usual bike rides along the city's canal.
The night that Angela went for her bike ride, she left around dusk, and she was turning 22 the next day. And her boyfriend stayed back to basically bake her a birthday cake. So she was gonna be back. They had a regular routine on a Sunday night.
They had planned to come back and watch one of their favorite TV shows together. But when Angela didn't show up hours after she was supposed to, Joe called 911 and filed a missing persons report. And that was completely unlike Angela. She was very prompt, she was very reliable, so Joe knew that something was wrong at that point.
The following day, a terrible discovery is made beside the canal.
So the next day, Angela's body was found relatively just south of Cactus and the I-17 freeway, which runs north and south. And she was found on a berm, displayed naked except for shoes and socks, and had been just basically horrifically stabbed, and she was also missing her head.
I remember it like it was yesterday. From where she was stabbed to where she was able to run, her clothing was cut at different points as she's being dragged. What was missing was her bike, which everyone knew that she was on, and that's what she was doing that night, was riding, and her Walkman that she used to listen to. So those were all gone, but everything else was pretty much at the crime scene.
Homicide detectives focus on Angela Brosso's injuries. They look for forensic clues to find out how Angela died.
The perpetrator came up either with his right or left hand, pulled her close, and then drove a very sharp knife into her back left side and up into her aorta. So she lived probably about 30 to 35 seconds, probably just enough to start to run away from the incident.
And there was a pool of blood. From that pool, there was a considerable amount of drag marks or blood smears on the pavement until there was a tree, and it looked like the killer either took a break or took some time there, and then he proceeded to drag her up a berm a considerable distance, and then that's where it appeared that he basically cut off her head and carved and did various things, stabbed her. It was a blitz-style attack.
Phoenix detectives have Angela's torso, but they're missing a crucial body part. But then, 10 days later, police get a call about a suspicious object seen floating in the canal.
So Angela's head was removed from the scene by the killer, and he apparently threw her head back into the canal about 10 days later. The individual who found that was a kind of a transient, really liked alcohol, but he had a nickname called the Fisher King. And so he's the one who told an employee at a business, hey, there's a head floating in the canal. And that employee made the call to the police. So he took off. So he was immediately considered a suspect because in police work, that's odd behavior and it needs to be checked out. So he was interviewed and looked at. They canvassed her apartment complex. It was a very large apartment complex. They canvassed the canal, the bike area, tried to talk to anybody and everybody that would have maybe seen anything that night.
There was definitely suspicion cast on Angela's boyfriend, Joe. And when you're looking at a homicide investigation, it's pretty routine for investigators to look at the people closest to the victim. And oftentimes it is the spouse or the lover or somebody like that. So Joe definitely was looked at the time, but he was eventually ruled out because he was at home. They were able to prove that, and it wasn't him.
When the missing head's recovered, Angela Brosso's body is sent for autopsy.
They were able to find DNA left behind at the crime scene on some of Angela's undergarments, and eventually it was tested that she was sexually assaulted and that there was DNA of somebody on her body. The problem was, at the time in 1992, they didn't have a match of whose DNA that was. The discovery of Angela's body is probably one of the most gruesome aspects of this entire case. And there was mass panic and fear that set in with this community because she had gone out on a bike ride at a very normal time in the evening. There were other people out, yet nobody had really seen what had happened, and nobody knew how she ended up dead. So you can imagine the Phoenix community is still paralyzed in fear at the fact that they had no idea who killed Angela Brosso. That killer was still on the loose, and then boom, another murder.
The Phoenix community, already terrorized by the brutal murder of Angela Brosso, but then just 10 months later, the body of another young woman discovered by the canal. Is there a sadistic serial killer on the loose? We find out next on Bloodline Detectives. November 1992, 22-year-old Angela Brosso last seen alive going for a bike ride along the Arizona Canal in Phoenix. The next day, her decapitated body discovered by the canal. Now, 10 months later, the body of another young woman discovered by the same canal.
Her mother got home that night, and when she left, Melanie was at home. Her mother figured out that Melanie apparently went for a bike ride. Her bike was missing. Her mother called the police. She's 17, so there's a little bit different response on a juvenile than there is an adult on a missing person. Officers looked. Unfortunately, we had no idea where she would have ridden her bike. And then the next day, there were reports of a bicyclist riding through blood, and then there was I believe a jogger that found her actually floating in the canal.
She was attacked in the area of I-17 and Dunlop. There were a part of her shirt that had been cut, part of her listening device to her Walkman and headphones. Her bike was also missing, and so was the Walkman. Her panties were found a little bit away from the scene, kind of over towards I-17 freeway. And when Melanie was removed from the water, she was dressed in a bodysuit that obviously was far too small for her body. That told me that this person put some time into this crime. He fantasized about how it was he wanted her to be. Melanie was killed in the exact same manner that Angela was, a stab to the lower left rib cage in the back. So the two kills were identical. So the investigators knew that they had a probable serial murderer that was stalking the canal banks.
There are clear similarities in the way these two young women were murdered. There is also one very crucial difference.
He did not take Melanie's head. There were superficial wounds to her neck where maybe he started or thought about it. There wasn't the rage that he had with Angela in this case. But he really honestly was more interested in trying to push the police toward somebody else, and particularly a gang here, in a local gang in Phoenix. And there was a gang on the west side, a very violent gang called the West Side City Crips.
The killer carved a cross into Melanie's chest and then carved the letters WSC, which at the time stood for a local gang. So then detectives are looking at this thinking, was this a gang killing? And are they leaving their signature or their mark on Melanie? But later on, investigators believe that the WSC was carved just to throw detectives off and that it didn't really have anything to do with who killed her.
Investigators look for every possible connection between the two murders.
During my investigation and looking at this, I believed that the girls were on their bicycles with their hands engaged on the handlebars. So they weren't able to defensively fight themselves off because they're holding themselves upright. So any person that came from behind, either left or right hand, would be able to get close enough to them to drive that knife in. So to me, the logical person would be somebody with military type training.
In the 1990s, DNA technology is still in its very early stages. For investigators in Phoenix, there's enough forensic science to help move the case forward, but not enough to solve it.
There were a lot of items recovered from both of the scenes. In cases like this, some of the primary and most important types of evidence to collect are going to be sexual assault kits obtained from the victims during their autopsies, and those were probably two of the most important items in these cases, one from each victim. In addition, both their clothing, the clothing from each of the girls was submitted, either items of clothing that they still had on their person or that had been removed were submitted for analysis. In addition, I know from both of the scenes, other areas or different items from the scene were collected. For example, rocks, blood stains, gravel, other items that may have been around, like bottles and cans, were collected and submitted for analysis. Once Angela's case happened, which was the first case, the laboratory analyzed evidence in the case and developed original testing results. And at that time, the detectives were actively submitting standards or known samples for comparison to that case. And then when Melanie's case happened, the investigators must have realized the similarities between the cases, young girls both riding their bikes along the canal and in generally the same area. But after Melanie's case would have been submitted and that evidence analyzed, they would have determined at that point that they had the same profile developed from both of the girls' cases, and that at that time they were forensically linked.
The two murders ended up being widely known as the Phoenix Canal murders. And I think the fact that it had that kind of name made it that much more infamous and people remembered it. So while it didn't leave people's minds, the case grew cold because there just wasn't any leads to go off of. But that only left more fear in the community because at that point, they had no idea who it belonged to, and now you've had a killer that's struck twice.
Two horrible murders, one serial killer, and a case that's going cold. Can revolutionary forensic science identify a ruthless killer? That's next on Bloodline Detectives. Phoenix, Arizona, 2011. The murders of 22-year-old Angela Brosso and 17-year-old Melanie Bernas in the 1990s remained cold. The killings are forensically linked by DNA evidence left behind by the killer. Now, a new cold case team thinks new forensic science can help them crack both cases.
There was a group that we had flown back to Philadelphia, and it was the VDOC Society. And it's a group of scholars, basically people from various disciplines that have a specialty in either DNA or blood spatter. So one of the things that particular profiler that helped us, he said he's in your files. 95% chance that he is somewhere in your files. So we just kept at the files, but they were, again, massive. And we kind of thought at some point, we're gonna be long gone or in a nursing home before we find this person. But then that's when the forensic genealogist it kind of entered into the picture and just blew our minds.
I went to the police department and gave my presentation on using Y-DNA. So there was about maybe 8 to 10 detectives, and they were very, very good. They listened. You could tell they were, forward-thinking people. So, okay, on the way out, I talked to I think it was the supervisor or the captain, and he said, well, there's this case we may be sending you. And I said, okay, that's fine. I'll look forward to hearing from you. And I left. And then maybe a few weeks later, they said, here's the Y profile on the case. I put it in my software. We had developed some software to do a lot of comparisons very quickly because it's kind of computational heavy. You come up with a list of what we call DNA cousins, or people that share DNA with your unknown person. Let's say it's Mr. X. And so you have a list of people that are related to your buddy there, but you don't know who these people are. So you immediately try and find out. And then you start building their trees out. Now, because they are related to Mr. X, they all have to be related to each other somehow. And so as you build the trees, they start to connect and connect and connect. And in a perfect case, you'll come up with 2 separate trees. And that will be one for mom and one for dad. And so you find one person in one tree, married a person in the other tree, and one of their children will be who you're looking for, because that person is related to both parents and all the matches in both trees. And that's like a unique combination. And I came up with 6 matches to the name Miller.
Now, the name Miller could not be more common in this area. But was there a Miller in Phoenix PD's case file? There were a few. So Colleen Fitzpatrick gives Phoenix PD this name. Hey, it's a match to Miller. Check your case file for that. And not only did they have a few Millers in the case file, but they had also been working with this organization called the VDOC Society that was made up of all these experts in law enforcement and forensics. And they had told Phoenix PD from a criminal profiling standpoint that it was likely that the killer was already in their files. So when they got the name Miller and went back to look at who there was, they started kind of a process of elimination. And it turns out Bryan Patrick Miller was already in the file as a possible person of interest.
Detectives dig deep into Bryan Patrick Miller's case file. They uncover disturbing facts from his teen years. In 1989, he attacked a woman at a Phoenix mall.
Miller was 16 years old, and he followed her off of a bus into a parking lot. She was going to a store, and he just ran up behind her and stabbed her. He was later caught and questioned. There was a police report made. He ended up getting about a year or so of detention into a detention system for juveniles, which is Adobe Mountain. He was there until his 18th birthday. There was one real interesting thing that we did find later, and that was a letter that he'd written. It was a letter about a fantasy killing that he had. He went through a mirage of detail in this letter, talking about a person who he made up and what he would do to this person, a female, young, how she dressed, what she would do, what kind of luggage she should bring on this venture, this fantasy adventure with this particular woman, how he would treat her, what he would do to her sexually, deviantly. And this is all when he's 17, sitting inside of a cell. He came up with this fantasy.
It was like, wow. So we called an emergency team meeting. Everybody was just kind of, we didn't know what to say, but we knew we had to get on it. Again, we didn't have the surveillance teams to really do their thing. They're the experts, but I have phenomenal detectives. They went to work, they did the surveillance, they watched Bryan, we studied him. He had so much out there on social media. He drove a zombie hunter mobile that was a converted police car. My detectives went out there and watched him. Did he throw a cigarette butt? No. He was a very law-abiding citizen when it came to trash. He wouldn't litter. And so that drove us nuts for some type of discarded DNA. And that's when Detective Schwarzkopf, I remember I was sitting there with my wife, I think we'd put the baby down, he called me and said, "Hey Troy," he's like, "I'd like to do this particular ruse. You know, enough's enough. We've been following this guy, let's just pull this ruse." And I said, "Let's run with it." So, and that's where we ended up doing the restaurant ruse.
I'm looking at where his car is, where he sits every day, same spot. And there's this huge warehouse that sits behind where he works. And he would be facing it all the time. And this warehouse has these huge garage doors. So I'm thinking to myself, what can I do to try to get some way to get this put together? So I come up with this in my mind and I put this thing together. I say, okay, and as I'm doing this, I get on the radio and I tell everybody, okay, I'm gonna go talk to him. I said, this is a waste of time. So I went up, knocked on his window. He rolled his window down. Obviously, I'm a stranger. And I told him, I said, I'm a security consultant. Me and my team have been hired to watch this warehouse because we believe that there's employee theft going on, that somebody's taking property out the back of this warehouse. I said, have you ever seen anything like that? And he gets out of his car, and it's really cold. It's spitting rain. And he goes, no. He goes, I've seen some delivery trucks come up there. And I said, okay. I said, you've never seen anybody, like big trucks come up? And I go, we see you out here all the time because we've been watching this parking lot. We see you come out for your breaks, and you sit in your car. And he goes, oh, yeah, I do all that here. I said, okay. I said, would you be interested in watching this warehouse for us while you're on your breaks? He goes, well, maybe. I go, well, I'll pay you. I said, you can become a security person. You can work for my security company. I said, and I'll pay you $20 an hour just to report and watch it. I said, you can tell me if you ever see anything or what goes on. He goes, well, great. He goes, I said, okay, so first I said, I got to do a background check on you. And I said, we got to meet. I have you fill out an application. So we'll do that, and I'll get a hold of you. This was right after Christmas, right before New Year's of 2015. He said, great. I said, give me his phone number. So after the first of the year, I call him up, say, hey, listen, you still interested in the job? Oh, yeah, we'll do it. So I said, okay, well, let's meet at a restaurant, and you and I can sit down, we'll do the application, and we'll get you hired. We met at a Chili's in Metro Center. He brought his daughter, which kind of shocked me. So we went in, we sat down, he's with his daughter, and I just started asking him some personal questions, like, hey, how long have you been in the Valley? You know, your daughter here, you know, what's the relationship? So we just sat back and forth, just kind of chewing the fat. And the meal came, we ordered meals. He ordered hamburger, I ordered a hamburger. And he started to eat. Then he obviously drank from his glass, which is all I needed. So we just conversed about different things. He said something was really odd that kind of just struck me as odd. He talked about his father who was in the military and he died at an early age. And I go, have you ever enlisted in the military? And he goes, well, I was. He goes, but I had some anger issues when I was younger. I'm like, really? And I didn't go any further, didn't ask him any further, but it was something odd that a normal person wouldn't say in an interview, having anger issues. And then after I knew that we had got his DNA probably would get his DNA from the glass that he drank out of, we said goodbye. He was really into steampunk, which I had no idea what that was, so he explained steampunk to me. And how he likes these types of Comic-Con types of fantasy type role-playing things. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, I've never done any of that, but that's interesting. So we bid adieu. Detectives who were inside of the restaurant, securing the area, and the owner who had waited on our table, she kept everybody out of the area, and they were able to gather up the dishes that he and his daughter used, and we were able to take custody of those.
Will the elaborate plan to collect a DNA sample from Bryan Patrick Miller work? We find out next on Bloodline Detectives. Phoenix, Arizona, 2015. It's been 23 long years since 22-year-old Angela Brosso and 17-year-old Melanie Bernas murdered along the Arizona Canal. Their cases go cold, and they stay that way until revolutionary forensic science helps investigators identify a prime suspect, Bryan Patrick Miller. Detectives secretly obtain a DNA sample from Miller, and now they wait for the results.
They collected that sample on a Friday. It was January 2nd, 2015. And on Monday morning, the screening analyst obtained the cup from our property annex, and what he did was swabbed the mouth area and prepared those samples for DNA. And then the DNA analyst assigned to the case, she then proceeded to do the DNA analysis on those swabs. She generated a profile to use for comparison to both of the cases. And on January 13th, 2015, both of the analysts came to my desk and told me that it was a match.
My phone went off several times. I didn't get it, but it was Kelly, and I was Kelly Merwin for the lab, the DNA supervisor, and I was like, well, Kelly usually never calls me. She calls me at my desk. And then the door flung open to the conference room, and her whole team was standing there. And I think we were shaking our heads, and we're like, they have a pristine, nice laboratory. They never come to headquarters, which was pretty run down. And so it was just odd. And we were all just looking, and she said, I remember, I'll never forget it. Kelly said, hey, you got your guy. It's him, it's Miller. And I think there was that 3.5 years of I liken it to almost like fighting a war, and then they announce, hey, it's over. You've got, it's done, everything's good. And we hugged, we had a mini celebration, and then everything kicked into high gear. The chain of command was notified. The next thing you know, you have SWAT team guys wanting to help and pouring in, and you have just chiefs and everybody, because these were two of the most horrific, heinous murders in the history of Phoenix, in the state of Arizona, really. It was fast track to, hey, let's get him. Let's get him and let's go search his house.
Bryan Patrick Miller arrested and charged with 2 counts, first-degree murder, 2 counts, kidnapping, and 2 counts of attempted sexual assault. The search of his house reveals a disturbing combination of hardcore porn, sadistic drawings, and a collection of knives.
I think they spent days and days and days going through his house. We did analyze evidence that was collected during that time, during that search warrant. There were different knives and potential weapons that we analyzed. I believe we also analyzed some teeth that had been found, but nothing obtained from that search warrant ever led back to either of the victims in our case. They brought his car down to the crime lab to be processed for evidence. And I remember that there was a group of us that were looking in the vehicle bay at his zombie hunter car. And one of the individuals that worked at the lab said, I pass this car all the time on the freeway. And it just kind of drove home that this individual had been living here this whole time, and people had seen him, and he was out and about. And so that was kind of an eerie feeling.
After 23 years, investigators and forensic scientists lead to the arrest of Bryan Patrick Miller for the vicious killings of 2 beautiful young women. But will a jury convict him? That's next on Bloodline Detectives. Phoenix, Arizona, 2022. Legal delays due to the COVID pandemic slow down justice for Bryan Patrick Miller. But now his trial for the violent murders of 2 young women in the 90s finally begins.
The way that this trial went was lengthy. Normally we would see a high-profile capital murder case wrap up in a month or two. This trial went on for 8 months. And it was a lot of clinical testimony. The defense wanted to try to convince the judge that Bryan Patrick Miller's diagnoses made it so he could not physically remember the crimes that were committed, and that the person that committed those was almost like an evil twin of Bryan, that he was a separate, dissociated person of the Bryan Patrick Miller that exists today. The prosecution, though, had multiple things on their side to dispel that. For one thing, DNA, right? The DNA, even the defense knew that they could not fight the DNA. They all but conceded, saying, yeah, he did do this, but he didn't know he did this. The prosecution is saying, no, the DNA was there, he committed these crimes. There was a clear aftermath of the crimes to put a bathing suit or a jumpsuit on a body and decapitate. I mean, that is deliberate. And to drag these bodies to the side as well, that shows that you're trying to cover up a crime. Therefore, it shows you know what you're doing and that you know what you're doing is wrong. But they also had some pretty powerful testimony to show that Bryan was not insane at the time. And part of that came from his ex-wife, Amy. We learned that Bryan was very controlling and had very violent tendencies toward Amy herself. She testified that in their sex life, he was very violent. He liked to make her bleed with pins and needles and actually eat the blood or suck the blood. And at one point told Amy that if he didn't love her so much, he would kill her. And he also confided in her about other crimes. When they lived in Washington, he talked about a woman that he attacked, a teenager, who they now believe is Victoria Michelson. And he also told Amy about another girl that he killed, a young girl who was going door to door in Phoenix. And police believe that was 13-year-old Brandy Myers.
So this was May 26, 1992. It was a day like any other. Brandy was a really sweet girl. I really felt like I was the big sister, though, because Brandy had special needs. I remember her all the time. And she was the kind of person who would stay inside and play with you when you were grounded, when she could be outside. And I think naive to this world, but super, super sweet. We were gonna go collect money for her bookathon. Her and I had went door to door in our neighborhood between our school and our house and knocked and collected pledges. And the prize was going to the zoo. And she really, really wanted to go to this zoo. And then when it was time for us to go, a boy that I liked named Destin came over. And I didn't want to go with Brandy anymore. I wanted to stay and play with this boy. And so I told Brandy she was a nerd and I couldn't be seen with her. And I don't even know why I said that. Like, you know, I was only 11. I will always be haunted by those last words. You know, we were those kinds of sisters where we, you know, picked on each other sometimes and fought and whatever. And I watched her go around the corner, and there was a little complex on the corner that had like big tree groves, and it was like cluster of trees, an opening and a cluster of trees. So I watched her go around the corner and pass through that opening, and then I never saw her again. I felt our connection leave, like that day. I don't know how to explain it, but I just knew she was gone. And I always knew it wasn't just bad. It was horrible and unspeakable, whatever had happened to her.
According to Amy, this was the only murder that Bryan admitted to. But Brandy disappeared, was never seen again. Miller lived within blocks of where Brandy disappeared. It would have been very easy for Brandy to walk up to the complex where Miller was staying. And based on what he told his ex-wife Amy He grabbed her, brought her in, killed her immediately, and then put her in a bathtub to save. The water was too warm and she started to decomposition, go into a decapitated state very quickly. So he had to get rid of her. So he chopped her up, put her in garbage bags, and got rid of her. She's never been found. It sounds plausible. There's a very high probability that Miller was involved. Clearly at that age, he was already doing those types of things and he was planning, his next adventure. So, 5.5, 6 months before Angela's death, it clearly falls into something that he would do. So I think there's probably a lot of credibility for him being responsible, but there's no evidence.
Bryan had moved multiple times. The house that he likely killed her in was occupied by a different family. Things had been redone. So there was no physical evidence that tied Bryan to Brandy's murder because her remains were long gone at that point if they were disposed, as he said, to Amy. And house had been redone. There just wasn't any DNA evidence, and unfortunately, Brandy was never found. So there was no body either. But Phoenix police believed there was enough circumstantial evidence to seek murder charges against Bryan Patrick Miller for Brandy Myers' death. And the Maricopa County Attorney's Office declined to prosecute because they just felt there was not enough evidence.
Brandy's still listed as a missing person. It makes me feel more desperate to get justice for her because she was just such a sweet kid. Like, I gave it my all, and this is the only fight I've ever lost in my life. If I could talk to Bryan Miller, I might try. If I could talk to him and he would talk to me honestly, I would want to know what she said, if she said anything. Did she cry out for my mom or myself, or what did she say, if anything? Was there anything that could have gave her comfort in the end?
The trial of Bryan Patrick Miller ends in June 2023. He is found guilty on all charges. The judge sentences Miller to death.
I don't know if families that go through what these victims' families went through can ever find closure, because I can only imagine that they must think about their loved ones every day. But my hope for the case is that the resolution that's been brought to these cases, with the identification of the suspect to his arrest and his conviction and sentencing, that I hope that brings some sort of relief to their family members, and knowing that he's not going to commit another crime like that again that would subject another family to what they've been subjected to over these decades.
This case is the perfect example of how important the advances in technology and DNA technology specifically have become. I don't think this case would have been solved had we not had these advancements in DNA and looking at a method like genetic genealogy that would have been looked at before as something crazy to try in law enforcement. I think these kinds of methods and advancements are completely changing forensics and criminal cases that might never have been solved. And this one could have been in a long number or a long list of cases that just never had an answer. And it was an unexpected answer at that, but that's exactly why this technology is so important, because there are people out there living in the public eye with nobody knowing who they truly are. And if this technology didn't exist now, those people may never face the consequences that they deserve. I do think there are other victims. I think he absolutely killed Brandy Myers. We'll never be able to prove that for sure, but police believe he killed Brandy Myers, and I do think that that's connected, but I do believe there are other victims that we don't know about. And that's the thing. There were other girls that went missing at that time or that were found dead, and those crimes are still unsolved. So could Bryan Patrick Miller be responsible for those too? It's very possible.
There's not a day, there's not a day or a minute that I don't think about her and think about what happened to her and just think in a selfish way about how my life would be so much better if she was here. You know I would have Auntie Brandy, and I know that my children would just love her. And like, my kids don't know her. You know, my youngest daughter has a picture of her in her room, and you know, we talk about her, and there are times when it's too much for me and I cry, and I'll ask my daughter for a hug. Can you give mommy a hug? And then she'll ask me what's wrong, and I will tell her I'm just missing Auntie Brandy. You know, like I just miss her. You know, there's nothing about my life that I think would be the same.
Bryan Patrick Miller, guilty of 2 horrible murders, but not a third one. 13-year-old Brandy Myers, which Miller's ex-wife alleges he admits to. But still, thanks to 3 generations of investigators and incredible forensic science, Bryan Patrick Miller will be living the rest of his days on death row, where he belongs. I'm Nancy Grace. Thank you for joining us here on Bloodline Detectives.